Here are some comments on Chapter 9, Introductions and Conclusions. I also call this commentary the Tell 'em rule. Chapter 9 tells us that introductions to speeches, that we should write them after we write the speech. That's such good advice. I tell the same thing to my students who are writing essays. The reason I recommend this procedure is because until you know what the essay or the speech actually says, you cannot fulfill one of the important jobs of an introduction, which is called the organizational preview of a speech or the forecasting passage of an essay. As important as this is in an essay, it's critical in a speech, because if your readers lose the path in an essay, they can always stop, go back up to the top, and figure out where and how they got lost. In a speech, they can't go back up to the top, so if they're lost, they're lost. For a good example of a forecasting passage or organizational preview, think about Steve Jobs' commencement address at Stanford University. Early on, he says, "Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life." And then he proceeds to tell the first story, and the second, and the third. He's actually making an argument, but he's telling those stories in the service of his argument. Another job of the introduction is for your audience to evaluate you positively. The authors of this chapter focus largely upon credibility, but there's more to it than simple credibility. What actually matters is something that might be called tribal membership. And you get this by what are called Ethos Appeals. In the chapter on effective listening, they mentioned ethos. And they focus largely upon having a credible ethos. Well, it turns out the word ethos and the word ethnic both come from the same Greek word, which is ethe, which is custom, habit, or practice. So if you belong to a community where men habitually have 5 wives, then it's perfectly ethical to have 5 wives in that community. So I want to point back to a claim the authors made in Chapter 1 regarding nonverbal messages, where they said, a person who gets up to speak wearing a nice suit will be interpreted more positively than a person giving the exact same speech wearing sweats and graphic t-shirt. Well, that may be true if the majority of the members of the audience are suit wearers, but if most of the audience are wearing sweats and graphic tees, then it's quite possible that showing up in a suit will have the opposite effect. If you take a look at these images, what these are examples of politicians who show up at least every 4 years in New Hampshire to campaign for votes there. These are people who normally in Washington would be wearing suits, and you'll notice that when they're campaigning in New Hampshire, they're all wearing plaid shirts. So Chapter 9 gives specific instructions on what to do to make your introductions accomplish the 4 jobs that they should do. They give equally effective instructions on how to compose your conclusion so it does the jobs that it should do. And both of these point to what I call the fundamental rule of public speaking, and it's called the Tell 'em rule. First, you tell them what you're going to tell them. Then you tell them. Then you tell them what you told them. All this points back to the needs of listeners who need a roadmap if they are going to follow what you actually say. So if you remember nothing more from this chapter or this presentation, I hope you at least remember that you should write your introductions after you have composed the body of your speech, because that's the only way that you can guarantee that the introduction you give actually matches the speech that follows.